Good morning, Earthlings. So, when are we flying to Mars? Probably not until we defeat all the cyber criminals. Grass, green grass, is what our designers are dreaming of. So today we're going to talk about all sorts of cyber threats for industrial enterprises and industrial infrastructures. I'll also talk about some real cases and tell a couple of stories that haven't seen the light of day yet, the results of our own investigations. And we'll try to make some predictions about what's ahead for us all and what to do about it. Firstly, about industrial enterprises, we ask the question, what's the worst thing to fear? Most would say ransomware. In some countries, for example in Russia, you might say, no, hacktivism, because we don't get as many ransom incidents. So let's look at some examples and see what we should really be afraid of, how and why. Let's start with hacktivists, because for Russia, this is a lot more relevant right now. We all know that most often they are politically motivated. They use publicly available, well-known tools, some kind of publicly available toolkit. Often all sorts of hacking software as part of their toolkit to delete data. There's also some similar reason for exfiltrating data, but not for the purpose of resale, but to simply cause some kind of media damage. But in reality, that's not it. They often go further. You can't pay them off, and it's impossible to decrypt encrypted data. And most often, it's impossible to stop the publication of stolen information. They have access to other additionals. They use some additional attack vectors that ransomware don't use. For example, they use insiders. In all other respects, it's more or less similar. Attacks on supply chains are already sophisticated attacks with long-term planning, with preparation of an attack for a specific target. We've seen all of this. In terms of personalities, they overlap. We often see that the same groups do ransom on Wednesdays and hacktivism on the weekends, or vice versa. Let's look at the most high-profile stories of hacktivist attacks. There are almost no technical details, but here there was an attack on vulnerable Israeli-made controllers used there in water delivery systems. There were random victims. For example, rebranded versions of these same controllers were used in an Irish village, and an attack on these controllers led to 160 houses being left without water for a certain time. Probably the most large-scale case of this kind recently was the attack on Iranian gas stations. This is the second attack. The first happened a year earlier, but this one was larger, and up to 70% of the infrastructure of all Iranian gas stations was disabled by hacktivist attacks. There are few technical details publicly available about these cases, so we won't dwell on them, but there are several cases that we researched and investigated ourselves. I can't name the exact targets and victims, but I'll share some technical details. This was an attack last year, an attack on an industrial equipment vendor. They supply mining equipment and control systems for this equipment, and they remotely control this equipment and provide access to clients. Quite a few organizations felt the impact of this attack because the pumps just stopped working in the oil fields. This is what it looked like in the publication in the hacktivists Telegram channel. They gained access to some system. Here it's already clear that it's some kind of web panel, and by the red icons we see that the pump is in a state of emergency. We started to understand what happened and help the vendor, and saw that in fact the entire system has a control panel used for monitoring operations and even to make changes to equipment operation. The control system was protected, there were firewalls and a VPN. The control panel had password protection. The passwords were strong and they changed often. I think only 4 people had admin passwords. There were 2 developers and 2 administrators, and it seemed that nothing could go wrong. But here's the thing, the control panel was simply on the internet. It was accessible not by VPN or any other way. There was no second factor of authentication. Plus, it was hosted on a public provider right on the same hardware as a lot of other different things, a lot of other infrastructure, including, for example, the Hedgehog kids hairdressing salon. So we started studying this case and found out that it wasn't password brute forcing. So it was either a supply chain attack through a vendor, or there were some vulnerabilities in their product itself. We tested both of these scenarios, and here's what we found. 26 SQL injections in the product, and based on the traces in the database, it was clear in some places that one of these SQL injections was used to create another administrator record for the system, and then everything falls into place.
Check the level of security maturity of your vendors. The second story is a big one. There will be a separate presentation about it today at 12 o'clock with Vyacheslav Kopaitsev. He'll tell you about it. It was an attack on a major enterprise, fertilizer plant. It was also hacktivists. They have a long track record there. They captured the plant after preparing for a very long time, and they post this video. They managed to gain control over the boiler shop and stop the equipment there. So there was a negative effect on the operations of the entire enterprise. On their Telegram channel, they're very active in the media space. They say they gained control over lots of different things, including gas piston power plant software station. They studied the internal documentation for a long time, including the safety documentation, and realized it was better not to touch it to avoid any serious consequences. But there was another case when this same object, the gas pumping station, was manipulated by other hacktivists. So this is essentially what the object looks like, big and complex, with some dangerous processes inside. While using NGFW here, they really proved that the product is useful. They discovered some abnormal traffic coming from the enterprise network, realized this traffic was actually from the plant's network, from the technological network, and found out that it was a DDoS attack on industrial sites, on government and various other sites. We started looking into it and found out that the SCADA server that sends telemetry data on the generation of electricity use was hacked. And all this was actually installed on it. All of this was installed from the account of a legitimate user, the administrator who worked with this server. So we contacted the vendor because we needed the administrator password to delete this whole thing from there. The company team didn't actually have the password. And literally a few minutes later, a remote employee connected to the server and started changing the settings on the SCADA server and on another one. So the decision was made to perform an emergency reboot of the server, remove the disk and treat it. We could probably end here, but you may have noticed that on the t-shirt of this guy that the LLM generated for me has something blurred out. This is an interesting note about the use of AI or machine learning systems. For my description, draw me a picture of a remote insider trying to hack something remotely. He has a mug with the words IT Army of Ukraine written on it. One of the 4 pictures had this abbreviation on it. It had to be blurred out because it coincided with the Russian transliteral abbreviation of the actual victims organization where this all happened. So be careful with them. Extortionists are cosmopolitan. It's such a balanced ecosystem. And the seemingly ever-growing market, and we're all afraid of them, or only those who are well protected aren't afraid. The biggest incidents in recent times, an attack on a port in Israel. 40% of the country's container traffic is blocked. 30,000 containers. The declared damage is 27 million, 200 million, a record of 356 million for the manufacturer of chemical products for a US brand. But if we look at our statistics on the exposure of industrial infrastructure to terrorism threats, we see that in general, across the world, this threat seems to be decreasing. Fewer and fewer extortionists are reaching industrial enterprises and their internal industrial networks. If you look at the statistics by how much money they earn, you can see that little by little the market is reaching a plateau. And it's even more important that this market is very vulnerable. It's vulnerable to geopolitical changes, other internal currents. The actions of law enforcement agencies, for example, in 2022, there was a drop of almost 40% on this market because extortionists were forced to become hacktivists. So maybe at some point they'll realize they need to look for other targets, and these are the scenarios that Evgeny started to recall today. We recently examined one truck here driving around the country and beyond, and it turned out that all the control units in it are vulnerable. And you can get into the main systems, the critical systems of the vehicle, the engine, gearbox, brake system, and so on. This may become possible because it can be done remotely, because the thermal block contains vulnerable modems. In just 4 text messages, I know the SIM card number of the vehicle, and with 4 texts to it, I can get full remote control of the vehicle and basically do whatever I want, like a remote control toy. This can be done with all vehicles of the series if you know the SIM numbers, and even if you know just one, you can somehow calculate or guess the others. So these scenarios are probable, and when attackers try to block ships, we're already seeing that ships are being infected with malware. Some parts of remote infrastructure, complex remote objects, and so on. We also see that attackers are making real efforts. Sometimes even today they're making efforts not to cause harm. But sometimes they can make mistakes and harm can be done, something accidental, and then we get a cyber-physical effect. We also understand that there's a high probability of using cyber tools for non-cyber crimes like smuggling, stealing goods. We even predicted this earlier. I mentioned this a year ago. And it seems that we could stop the presentation at this point, but we forgot about PT. There's no real need to remember about PT because they don't cause any direct damage. They quietly penetrate your networks, steal some data, penetrate from somewhere else, and that's about it. There are rare cyber-physical operations, but most likely they won't affect you because it's only in certain countries and extremely rare, once or twice a year. Well, recent events have changed my ideas a little about what's possible and what's impossible. If everything really happens again, if our predictions that cyber-technical means will be used for smuggling, for example, if they're really confirmed, now they're analyzing dumps of leaked information, trying to get confirmation of the statements of hacktivists, then perhaps we should somehow reconsider our attitude to many things. And we will fly to Mars. Probably not soon because it requires participation from everyone. And how can you cooperate when no one trusts anyone?